Hello and welcome again to Black Hat Theology. This is installment 13. Today we are concluding our three-part mini-series on the later philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein as it is expounded in works such as Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. The reason we undertook this Wittgensteinian excursus is that we thought it might help us with a problem we encountered in the course of evaluating Rudolf Otto's very influential phenomenology of the holy. What I want to do in today's lecture is four things. First, I want to remind us briefly of what that problem in Otto's phenomenology is. Secondly, I want to provide a brief overview of the insights we gleaned from our discussion of Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Thirdly, I want to apply some of those insights to Otto's problem in order to solve it. And fourthly, I want to look ahead to our next lecture by describing some of the objectives or tasks that we will be undertaking there. So let's begin with the first point. What is the problem with Otto's phenomenology of the holy? Now remember that within the overall phenomenon of the holy, which Otto refers to as a noumenal experience of the holy, Otto distinguishes two poles. There's a subjective pole, and that has to do with the numinous. These are our subjective feelings, our subjective states, our emotions, the emotions that we undergo when we feel that we are in the presence of something holy. Then on the other hand, there's the objective pole, and that's the noumen. That is the purported object of those subjective states that we feel, of the purported intentional object of the numinous, and that is the holy presence itself. Now, remember that Otto ascribes two noumenal attributes to the holy, to the noumen, the holy noumen. The first of those he calls mysterium tremendum, and that's where the holy appears to us as something overawing, as something powerful, something that's almost overpowering and very, very energized, let's say. And that corresponds to our numinous experiences of the holy as something that awes us, that's something that we find is a little bit frightening, and that produces a certain amount of agitation in us when we feel that we are in the presence of it. The second noumenal attribute that Otto ascribes to the holy noumen is mysterium fascinans, and that's when the holy appears to us as something worthy of being desired, something desirable. Corresponding to that noumenal attribute, he thinks, are our numinous feelings of desiring the holy, of wanting to be united with it, being drawn towards it. So there's a kind of push-pull here. The numinous experiences that are associated with mysterium tremendum, that's sort of a pushes us away from the holy or pushes us back a little bit, whereas the numinous experiences that correspond to the mysterium fascinans draw us towards the holy. There's a push-pull. The problem, briefly, with Otto's phenomenology here is that he doesn't rule out the possibility that as opposed to there being only one holy noumen with each of those noumenal attributes, there are in fact two holy noumena, each one of which has one of those attributes. Now, why did we turn to Wittgenstein's philosophy, or why did we think that that might help us to get past this problem? Well, a central theme in Wittgenstein's discussions of pain in the Investigations, and also of the Sinister in his Remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough, is the notion of grammar, where by that Wittgenstein does not mean like Chomskyan transformational grammar or schoolbook grammar or anything like that. He means our various language games, our linguistic practices, and our everyday ongoing activities that give us a purchase on what something is. So in the case of pain, Wittgenstein rejects the idea that pain is some essentially private object in the case of each person who has a pain, so that each person in pain has his or her own essentially private object that nobody else can access. And he wants to say that, well, we understand pain, what pain is, by understanding the grammar of pain. What is that? That is the battery of our responses, our behavior when we're in pain, like wincing or maybe clutching the shoulder, our behavior towards others when they're in pain, so when we try to comfort them, when we console them, or when we treat them, if we happen to be physicians or physical therapists or whatever, all of those things, the things that we would point to if we wanted to teach a child what we mean by the word pain in English, that whole constellation of language games, of linguistic practices and everyday activities is what Wittgenstein means by the grammar of pain. And that tells us what pain is. Now, remember that in our discussion there's been a sort of trajectory, because it is the case that even though you don't have your own essentially private pain and I don't have mine, nevertheless, your pain is different from mine. There's no single pain that all of us experience. You have your pain and I have my pain. That's also part of the grammar of pain as Wittgenstein understands it. So if we want to get to the holy as some kind of unified phenomenon, something that's purportedly real out there that we all can experience under certain circumstances, we need to move beyond pain. But what's important about Wittgenstein's analysis of pain is that he begins to develop this notion of something being objective or real without being a particular object. If we can apply that to Otto's phenomenology of the holy, then we might be able to understand the noumen, which is purportedly what our numinous feelings and emotions and all of that are about. We might be able to understand that not as something real, but not as a particular object, so that the question of whether, well, is it one object or two, doesn't even arise. That whole metaphysical problematic gets deconstructed. So that's why we turn to Wittgenstein. And it's also why we move beyond pain to look at Wittgenstein's discussion of what he calls the sinister. When we reflect upon certain latter-day religious festivals or rites like the Beltane Fire Festival, in which people feign to burn someone alive after they draw lots, and whoever draws the lot with the black mark on it is then seized by the other people, and they go through the motions, they pretend to sacrifice that person by fire. Wittgenstein says, well, this kind of ritual, when we look at it and we see how the participants in it behave, we feel that there's something sinister about that seems to point at something strange, not only in the participants, but also in ourselves, especially when we think about the festival against the backdrop of our general knowledge that throughout human history, human beings have engaged in human sacrifice by fire. They have committed very grisly things like that, even if the particular festival, like Beltane, cannot be traced back. It's not actually has not descended from some primordial sacrificial fire rite. Our general knowledge that has happened in the course of human history, when we bring that to bear on the festival, then and our experience of the sinister there, that seems to point or purport to be about some very strange feature about ourselves, about human beings. Something in us that's odd. Now, the reason that that's important to keep in mind is that Wittgenstein here has given us a sort of single object, if you will. I'm using that term very loosely. There's a single kind of reality that our feelings when we watch something like the Beltane Festival, that strangeness is a uniform or unified phenomenon. There's not one strangeness over here and some other strangeness over there. There's that strangeness that's common to all of us. And that carries us closer to the unified phenomenon of the holy that we need. Another point to keep in mind here is that we really don't have any purchase on the kind of sinister feelings that Wittgenstein is talking about, apart from our reflection on Beltane and similar festivals against the backdrop of our general knowledge about what human beings have done to each other over the course of their history. If you want to say, well, what is the feeling of the sinister? Well, I don't really have any. It's the very kind of feeling that I have when I think about those kinds of festivals and how people behave there against the backdrop of my general knowledge that people throughout human history have engaged in a sacrificial rite of fire. They burn people alive in order to sacrifice them. So those feelings that we have when we reflect upon the festival against the backdrop of that general historical knowledge, those are like the numinous feelings that purport to be about this strangeness that is common not only to the participants in the festival, but to us ourselves, because we recognize them as akin to us in some strange way. Now, we are now in a better position, I believe, to extend this kind of analysis to the holy. And what I want to do is to look at a very suggestive and evocative passage from Otto's work on the holy and bring these Wittgensteinian insights to bear on this passage. So this is from a story by Max Eith. I don't remember the name of the story, but if you consult Otto's book, it's certainly referenced in that. And what's happening at this point in the story, in that Otto is summarizing in his book, is that two people, I think it's the narrator, and he's accompanied by an old man, they come across this mighty bridge that took years and years to build, and that's withstood all kinds of inclement weather throughout the decades, but now has been utterly destroyed by a cyclone. And so there's this vast scene of devastation that is spread out before the narrator and the old man, in whose company he encounters the bridge. And so what they do when they see this or encounter this scene of utter devastation or this destruction of the bridge is that they kneel. There's this bright, in other words, there's this gap where this mighty bridge used to be. There's this gap there, and it's filled with this sort of eerily blue sky, this emptiness. And so what the old man and the narrator do in the story is kneel. They kneel before this because they feel that it's something awe-inspiring, it's something overpowering. Then this is what Otto says about that. Why did they kneel? Why did they feel constrained to do so? One does not kneel before a cyclone or the blind forces of nature, nor even before omnipotence merely as such, but one does kneel before the wholly uncomprehended mystery, revealed yet unrevealed, and one's soul is stilled by feeling the way of its working, and therein its justification. So it's the mystery. Now this is getting closer to the holy. So the old man and the narrator kneel. And this process, or this act of kneeling, points to other gestures that we might think are suitable when we encounter the holy mystery. Gestures like, well, bowing, or bowing our heads in reverence, genuflecting, the way we do in the Catholic Church. We might fold our hands in prayer. We might raise our hands in hieratic worship, in a sort of hieratic gesture. We might sing. We might lift our voices in song. Or we might just sit there in silent meditation facing outward or facing the sky. So what we have here is a whole panoply of human gestures, kneeling, bowing, both the head and perhaps the body, genuflecting, meditating, singing, gesturing or gesticulating in certain hieratic ways. This whole panoply or vocabulary of gestures is what I want to say is part of the grammar of the holy. It's part of the grammar of the holy. These are the kinds of customary behaviors and practices that human beings exhibit when they feel that they are in the presence of the holy mystery. And so that's how I want to begin to apply Wittgenstein's notion of grammar here. Now, moreover, what's extremely important is, and also this is really part of the episode that Otto describes in the book from Max Eith, this scene of the missing bridge that's been destroyed, this eerie gap that's just filled by empty blue sky, that is overawing, it's a little frightening, but it's also a little fascinating. It's something that these two in the story feel drawn to. They don't run away, they stay. And yet they don't run forward and embrace it, they kneel. And they just silently contemplate it. So notice that the grammar of gestures that I have mentioned in connection with the holy, those same gestures are applied whether we feel overawed by the holy presence or are a little bit frightened and taken aback by it, overpowered by it, or whether we feel fascinated by it and drawn to it and desire to be united with it, all of those things are occurring at once. And all of those things are articulated and are manifested or conveyed through the same gestures. The kneeling, the bowing of the head, the raising of the arms in a certain way, the genuflecting, the singing, and so on. And so it's that unified grammar of human behavior and gesture, that common vocabulary of gesture, that's one and only one. And that is the same whether we happen to be feeling at that particular moment that we're feeling a little overpowered by this mysterious presence, or we're feeling quite fascinated by it and it's something that we want to embrace. We behave the same way. And we don't point in different directions. It's a very simple point here, I think. We don't look over here. When we feel that we're in the presence of the holy, you're not looking this way and I'm looking that way. We're looking in the same direction. And often we're looking up into the sky, or we're pointed into the same direction. When we go to a mass or a religious service, a Gottesdienst in German, the people are all facing the same way. It's not like when you have your pain and I have my pain and we're both nasal gazing, perhaps because we have stomach aches. We're all looking in the same direction. We're all looking outward together and undergoing these same performing these same gestures that I have called the grammar of the holy, the religious grammar, that convey the point that there's a unified phenomenon here that purports to be out there, that is appearing to us under different aspects. But regardless of whether it appears to us under the aspect of mysterium tremendum or mysterium fascinans, we behave fundamentally the same way. And it's that fundamentally behaving or gesturing in the same way that gives us our purchase on what it is to understand the holy as one and only one, something out there, not an object that we can point to and count off like milk cartons, but some mysterious, real, overpowering, fascinating presence that we note as such, or that we mark as such, or understand as such through the unity of gestures that I have just described. That's what it is to understand the holy as purporting to be something real, but only one of which is out there, the holy. Not holies, not holy noumena, only one holy noumen. That is the purported intentional correlate of our religious gestures. Now, that leads me to the final task or objective that I want to fulfill today, and that is to look ahead to the next lecture. A very important confusion that I want us to avoid here is I am not suggesting that the holy is simply the totality of the gestures that I just described, these religious gestures, that this unity of gesture that we exhibit, whether we feel that we're being overawed by the holy or we feel that we're being attracted and fascinated by it. The holy is not reduced to those behaviors any more than pain is reduced to human behavior. Remember, Wittgenstein is not a behaviorist about pain, the way B.F. Skinner is. He thinks that there is a gap between our behavior, our pain behavior, and pain itself, because people can feign pain. They can pretend to be in pain when they really aren't by going through all these pain behaviors, right? Or they can be in pain, really be in pain, but not go through any of the behaviors because they're being stoic, and they might tell us about that later. And so Wittgenstein is not any kind of behaviorist about pain. And similarly, I am not any kind of behaviorist about the holy. I am not saying that the holy, as the purported unified intentional correlate of our gestures, of our religious gestures, I'm not saying that it is the same as those gestures, because then there wouldn't be anything to God or the holy other than the fact that people go through the motions. And that can't be right. Nobody who believes in God or takes that seriously is going to reduce God to human behavior. So what is the point of that? The point is that we have to be able to give some kind of explanation of what it is to get the holy right, if you will, or what is it to respond properly to the holy, as opposed to get it wrong And that's what we're going to try to do in the next lecture. What we need to do is show how we can have the opportunity, when we experience this holy presence, we have the opportunity to do what it wants us to do or not. We can follow it correctly, or we can not follow it. We can make mistakes, or we can choose not to follow it correctly, as the case may be. So there has to be something to the notion of getting it right, getting the holy right, following the holy properly as opposed to improperly. And what we are going to try to do in the next lecture is to explain what that is by providing an analysis of what it is for the holy to become deeply interwoven and integrated into human agency in such a way that we can follow it correctly, act correctly in accordance with the holy, or not. And that will help us to safeguard against any suggestion or confusion that there's some kind of behaviorism about the holy that's being offered here. That is not the case. So I'm going to end there today. Next time we'll take that up. Again, I welcome your questions. I will try to respond to them, Lord willing, on my YouTube channel. But I also encourage you to think about this. You might want to consult some of the works that I have mentioned if you have the time to peruse them. There's a wealth of material there, whether we're talking about Otto or on the idea of the holy, or Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations, or Remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough. So I promise you that all of these works are well worth considering. The effort of reading them and thinking about them will pay you dividends if you undertake it. So I will see you next time, and this is Peter Dillard signing off for Black Cat Theology. Thank you.